Chapter 20. Cyberdyne Systems. The Present. Serena shifted minutely in her chair, slightly uncomfortable from the laparoscopic surgery her third Terminator had performed last night. Her second had found another host for a fertilized egg, and so she'd had one removed and had it shipped off this morning. This new host would not be given drugs to speed the growth of her fetus, and the clone itself would be allowed to grow more normally. For the sake of the mission, Serena wanted the first to be a well-grown child within 6 weeks' time. But since none of the I-950s had been pushed this hard, there was no way of telling what the ultimate product would be like. For now, she had to be content with her second's assurance that the fetus appeared to be developing normally. The I-950 was delighted to finally have that project online, even if it had left her a little bit sore this morning. She focused her attention on Cyberdyne's CEO. Roger Colvin sighed and dropped the report she'd given him onto the desk. He closed his eyes and massaged the bridge of his nose for a moment, then sighed again. "Why don't you summarize for me, Miss Burns?" he suggested. "Certainly," she said crisply. "There are some important contradictions here. When the plane was going down, the pilot, presumed to be Mary Warren, was screaming, 'The engines! The engines!' But subsequent examination of the aircraft has shown no sign of engine trouble. In fact, there appear to have been no mechanical problems at all. As far as the investigators could determine, the plane was in perfect operating condition." Colvin tapped his fingers on the desk. "So?" he asked. "What do you think that means?" "It means," Serena held up one finger, "pilot error." She held up a second. "Murder, suicide." She held up a third. "Or assassination." The CEO turned away with a pained expression. "Mary had no reason to commit suicide. She loved her life. And those were her best friends," Colvin went on. "And Mary was a good pilot." "That would seem to leave assassination," Serena said calmly. "No, it doesn't," Colvin snapped. It could have been wind shear or some other weird localized phenomenon." "There's been an inquiry regarding the Sacramento facility," her third Terminator sent. It hooked her into the ongoing inquiry, and as she followed the unauthorized investigation, she also followed the Terminator's trace on the line. Meanwhile, she kept her features trained to the mask of an interested listener for Colvin's benefit. "I just don't see Tricker doing something like that," Colvin said. He held out his hand in a reasoning gesture. "I mean, it makes no sense." "It makes no sense to the average, reasonable human being," Serena said. "But I'm not altogether certain that Tricker belongs in that category." "Cayman Islands," the Terminator said. "Account of Jackson Sky, investment counselor. Such people launder money for individuals and corporations." Serena ordered it to trace Sky's name, to see if he had previously had contact with Connor or von Rossbach. Her tap on the Estancia's phone had indicated that von Rossbach had disappeared at the same time as the Connors. The phone calls had definitely become more interesting since he'd left home. That Marietta was quite a gossip. "Jackson Sky has been investigated by the sector. He is currently in their pay as an informer." the Terminator reported. Serena nodded soothingly at Colvin. Check the sector's database. See if von Rossbach is the agent that brought him in. There was a brief pause. Affirmative, the Terminator reported. See if the sector has bugged his office. If so, tap in and patch it to me. Serena shifted in her chair again. Please don't think that I want Mary Warren to have been murdered, she insisted. I just have always found it so strange that an experienced pilot on a frequently travelled flight path should go down in what was supposed to be ideal weather conditions. And now that the investigation of the wreckage has found no sign of mechanical failure despite all that yelling about the engines. She waved her hands helplessly. Well, I just think we'd better be more cautious than ever. That's all. Colvin smiled ruefully. Well, that is your job, he said. Here, he continued. Before I let you go, I should show you this. He separated a sheet of paper from those in his out basket and handed it across the desk. It's from Ronald Lebain. Have you heard of him? Serena took the paper and began to read. No, she said absently. She looked up. Should I have? Colvin shrugged. He's kind of a new agey environmentalist type. His book is still on the bestseller lists after I don't know how many months. Go ahead, he said with a sweep of his hand. Read his letter. This came in the mail, Serena asked. Email, Colvin said. I got it this morning. The letter was brief and to the point. Lebain told them that he'd heard about their totally automated factory concept and listed his objections to it. He pointed out that it would, if successful, put huge numbers of people out of work. He pointed out that such people would be very angry and warned that he would do his utmost to organize them. It ended with a plea to Cyberdyne to reconsider their actions. Serena looked up, her face grim. I don't need this right now, she thought. How, I wonder, did he hear of this? She said evenly. When this is the first I've heard of it. Colvin cleared his throat and looked away. We didn't tell you this, but the military absolutely loved the idea. We've been moving ahead on it, and we've just broken ground for a munitions factory in Texas. So the leak could be anybody. She handed the paper back, her face stern. In a way, I'm relieved. With so many other people in the loop, it need not represent a leak at the highest levels of Cyberdyne. In other words, this didn't happen on my watch. Of course, everything to do with Cyberdyne was on her watch, technically. I suppose not, he agreed, but it should be looked into. Yes, Serena said, with a slow nod. It should. You humans have to be looked into constantly, don't you? She thought, with a flick of exasperation. This Lebain character should be looked into as well, she said aloud. That was a threat he made against this company, and with Cyberdyne's history, that shouldn't be taken lightly. I advise you to mention this to Tricker. Colvin shrugged, looking puzzled. It's not like I can call him up, you know. She said noncommittally. He needs to know about this. He'd be the one to question the military types who are involved in this project. She swiveled her chair slightly. I'm sure you'll hear from him soon. It's his job to show up when he's needed. Or not wanted. She added wickedly. I'll look into who might have known about those plans at Cyberdyne. You'll provide me with a list of people that you and Mr. Warren discussed it with. Since I don't know anything about that, because you certainly didn't discuss it with me. Of course, the CEO replied. Do you want me to investigate the contractors? She asked. Or shall we leave that to Tricker? Colvin thought. It might be a good idea for you to do some preliminary checking into the company's background, he said. I'm reluctant to step on Tricker's toes, but it's probably a good idea for us to know more about them anyway. And then, if he doesn't want to investigate, we'll have a head start. Serena smiled and nodded. This poor little human was terrified of the government liaison. I wonder what Tricker has on him, she thought. Perhaps she should do something to make him as terrified of her. I'll be very discreet, whatever I do, Serena assured him with a smile. There wasn't much to say after that, so they concluded their meeting quickly. Serena left annoyed because she'd been unaware that this project had even moved forward. The brutally honest self-evaluation that had been drilled into her from birth acknowledged that she should have been aware of what they were doing. She'd grown careless and had neglected to keep an eye on the president and CEO. Allowing yourself to have contempt for your enemy is a betrayal of common sense, she quoted to herself. It was one of John Connor's sayings. Still, she was the one who had given the schematics and plans to them, as well as being their head of security. They should have kept her informed. As Serena walked back to her office, Third succeeded in connecting her to the video spy devices that the sector had installed. She watched the activity in Jackson Sky's home-based office, superimposed over Cyberdyne's surroundings, waiting impatiently for the sound to come through. The Connors and their ally had been interrupted by another man. Sky, no doubt, who seemed to be arguing with them. For this she was grateful, since it allowed her time to get back to the office, where she could give this situation a bit more of her attention. When she saw the sector agent's face, a small chill ran up her gut, and she almost missed a stride. That face. A quick search of passive storage. Yes, that is the model for the features of the T-101A series. The originals. Skynet had chosen the template from a list of anti-terrorist personnel. Ironic, in a way, since the Terminators were the greatest terror weapon ever developed. The Connors and von Rossbach's efforts to get rid of the man were not proving very successful. Good, she thought emphatically. Why should she be the only one to suffer the consequences of someone else's self-important stupidity? As she walked along, she booked third on a flight to Florida, where it would pick up a short flight to the Caymans. It should be able to prevent the Connors and their ally from heading for Sacramento within 8 hours. From the way the Connors were pursuing their investigation, Serena doubted they'd be ready to leave before tomorrow. At least, she hoped not. It would be better if they could be contained on the island. Once they hit the United States, they'd be much harder to track. Finally, von Rossbach ended the man's arguments by turning him around and pushing him through the office door, which he then slammed in the investment counselor's face and locked. Then he turned to the other two and brushed his hands off. They smiled. So that's what he looks like, the I-950 thought, studying the smaller male. Of course, he's young just now. She'd only seen his shoulder and the top of his head before Skynet called her away. Her earlier impression had been that Connor was a slender man, but not unusually so, what humans called wiry. Right now, though, he was a skinny little thing and very unimpressive. And that's Sarah Connor. The woman was frowning with concentration. She was also smaller than the I-950 had imagined her. Well, it was only natural to have imagined them bigger than life. They had, after all, and with 20th century weapons no less, somehow defeated 2 Terminators. Not an easy task, but a very, very impressive accomplishment. Serena frowned as she entered her office, locking the door behind her. Did that thought have a touch of negativity about it? The Connors weren't that impressive, and negativity led to defeat. The I-950 sat behind her desk and studied them. They were trying to hack into the Sacramento database. She concentrated on the files her 3 enemies were working on. She allowed them to look at some administrative records and smirked at their excitement. Then she had to move quickly to prevent John from exploiting what he'd found to locate another site. For the next hour, she dueled with him over the information she would concede as she struggled to hide anything of real worth. Sarah and von Rossbach ably assisted him, and things were almost at the limits of her control for a while. These people were smart. It was easy to forget that humans could be so dangerous. The ones she dealt with every day, with the exception of the elusive Tricker, were easy to anticipate and to deal with. Most of them were barely awake, sentient only as a matter of genetic technicalities. The Connors and their ally were exhilarating. She would have to be careful not to give in to her currently more humanized nature and compete with them. The object was to totally defeat them, not to gratify her own ego. A part of Serena's mind reflected that it was regrettable that she had an ego at all. She'd prefer to be less annoyed by Colvin and Warren's end run around her awareness. It was distracting, and unquestionably the result of bruised ego. But experimentation had shown that dealing successfully with humans required the Infiltrator to have one. You couldn't pretend to have something so incomprehensible. It was necessary to have actually experienced it. True, hers was stunted next to a human's, but the damn thing had a tendency to grow if it wasn't carefully attended to. Part of the responsibilities of her computer brain was to send a prompt if the thing got out of hand. She expected to receive one momentarily. The Connors were slowing down now, beginning to get a bit frustrated. Serena's lab, the present. The 3rd Terminator decanted the 2 who had been in the vats growing their disguise of flesh. He then set them to prepping the next pair, now mere metal skeletons, while he checked the 4th and 5th over for flaws or gaps in their newly grown skin. Finding nothing amiss, he reported a satisfactory rating to the I-950. "Acknowledged," she said. "I'm sending you to the Cayman Islands. Dress in light-colored, casual clothing. Wear sunglasses at all times. Pack a small bag so that you'll blend in with other travelers. Take the low-signature automatic, your passport and driver's license, and one of the copies of the special health certificate. Call a taxi to take you to the airport." She transmitted the details on its flights. "Go to Sky's home. Terminate all humans you find there. Your primary targets are Sarah and John Connor. If they are not at Sky's home, find them and terminate them." "Understood," it acknowledged. It closed down transmission when the I-950 signaled, "Out." Its chores in the lab finished, Third made its way upstairs to the house. It called a cab, then dressed and packed. There was a wallet with cash and credit cards in the small safe in the home office. It removed these and the travel papers that the I-950 had specified, tucking them into pockets about its person. Weapons were hidden in an access panel in the I-950's bedroom. It took the fiber and synthetic pistol it needed and then stood by the front door to wait for the taxi. The cab driver wanted to talk, and the Terminator let him. It answered any questions as briefly as possible, just as the I-950 had trained it. It's important to at least be what humans consider polite, Serena had instructed them. But answer as briefly as possible. Give the humans no reason to remember you particularly. It didn't see why it couldn't solve such problems simply by terminating anyone who asked too many questions. It followed orders, of course. It just didn't understand. So it answered the driver with yeses and nos and grunts. Soon it noticed that the driver wasn't paying attention to its answers anyway. The airport was already coming into view. It picked up its ticket and walked through the metal detector. When the security drone made to wave her wand over the Terminator's body, it presented a doctor's certificate claiming that several injuries had led to a degenerative bone disease that had required the replacement of most of its joints with surgical steel replacements. Third's neural net processor prompted it to say something to accompany the certificate. It selected the third choice. "Wherever you run that," it said, indicating the wand, "it's going to go off." Third held out its arms as though cooperating anyway. The woman with the wand hesitated, then shrugged and ran the wand up and down the Terminator's body. As it kept dinging, she began to smile. Then she stopped, straightening up. "That must have hurt," she commented as she waved him on. "It did," Third said. The flight wasn't full, so Third got to sit by itself. It accepted a drink, but refused food. It watched the movie, a comedy, attentively. The I-950 had told them that while the situations were exaggerated, they could still learn a great deal about human interaction from filmed entertainment. Any humor in the movie, if there was any, completely escaped its understanding. The actors were worse at imitating human beings than an experienced Terminator. It thought the characters were idiots, one and all. But then, most humans were idiots. It just didn't think they were this stupid. Perhaps that was why this movie was considered humorous. It would ask the Infiltrator unit when it returned from its mission. The I-950 would know. The Terminator walked through Owen Roberts International Airport on Grand Cayman, scanning the brightly clad crowd, salted with blank-faced men in suits, and its surroundings when a movement on the tarmac alerted its sensors. It stopped stock still and looked out the large window to the ground some 20 feet below. A boy of 16 or so came back into view. Third could only see the back of his head, but an instantaneous comparison of the file pictures from Sky's office confirmed that this was John Connor, with a negligible error probability. It signaled the I-950. Have arrived at Grand Cayman. Have John Connor in sight. He is at the airport, apparently readying to depart. Below, a woman wandered into sight. Beside her was a large man. Another, smaller man seemed to be leading them towards an aircraft. Sarah Connor, confirmed. Dieter von Rossbach, confirmed. It reported. Stop them, Serena ordered. Terminate them, discreetly if possible. But at any cost, terminate them before they can leave the island. Third reached out and snagged a passing woman who looked as if she might work for the airport. It pointed to the tarmac outside. How do I get down there? It asked. The quickest way. You have to have a ticket, the woman said, trying to pull her arm away from his grasp. Where do I get such a ticket? It demanded. She winced as his grip hardened. That's the charter airline section, she said. Waybright Charters is just down there and to the left. She tugged and he let go, ignoring the glare she gave him as she moved off, rubbing her arm. Their escort led them to a small jet plane that stood baking in the Caribbean sun, its idling engines adding their bit of heat and an extra tang of burnt kerosene. He waved them on board. I can just put those bags in here, he said, pointing to a bin in the wing. No, Dieter said. We'll keep them with us. The man nodded. People often were chary of letting their hand luggage out of sight on Waybright Charters. He often fantasized about what was in those bags. But at the end of the day, he figured that he was happier not knowing. Sarah, John, and Dieter settled into the comfortable grey leather seats. There was none of the elbow-to-elbow crowding of a normal commercial flight on this plane. Dieter nodded appreciatively. The plane was small, designed for not more than 6 passengers, but luxurious. The seats swiveled, and there was a tiny bar kitchen near the back, opposite the lavatory. Cool, John said, slapping the wide arms of his seat. No greyhound with wings this time. The pilot came aboard, wearing some very dark aviator glasses. Hello, lady, gentlemen, he said. I hear we're heading for a little airport in Corpus Christi. That so? In answer, Sarah smiled and handed him a folded slip of paper. He took off his glasses to read it, raising his brows as he did so. Old Mexico, he said. Sure, I can do that. You sure of these coordinates? Yes, she said. Hey, he said, holding up his hand and beginning to move forward to the cockpit. I don't want to know. He turned back with a grin. I don't want to know your name. I don't want to know your fake names. I don't want to know what you're really doing or what story you're telling. I'm paid to fly you where you want to go, and that's all I want to do. So strap in, settle back, and enjoy your flight. The three passengers exchanged amused glances, then obediently fastened themselves in and settled back to think their separate thoughts about the upcoming visit to the United States. Sarah had wanted to visit one of her weapons caches in Tamaulipas near the Texas border so they could stock up. She had friends in a nearby town who would sell her a safe car with American plates. It would probably be easier for them to cross into the US through one of the border checkpoints than through the airport anyway. The higher volume of traffic meant that if you looked right, you got past fairly quickly. And they were all experts at looking right. The plane began to glide smoothly forward, the twin turbines emitting muffled screams. Third walked up to the counter of Waybright Charters and said to the woman behind the counter, "Those people who just went down to the tarmac. I'm supposed to be with them. How do I get down there?" She gave him a suspicious look. He was huge, and she couldn't see his eyes through the dark glasses. His manner was brusque, and his body language was vaguely threatening. All in all, he was a type that this company saw fairly often. Policy was to be absolutely non-cooperative. "They didn't say anything about a fourth party," she said at last. "I'm running late," it said. "They must have given up on me. How do I get to them?" "I'm sorry," she said carefully, "but theirs is a private charter. I can't stop the plane for you when you aren't on their list." "I'm supposed to be with them," Third insisted. "It's important. Sell me a ticket and hold the flight." "I can't do that," she insisted. "They've been cleared." "Charter a plane to follow them," Serena ordered. It might not be possible, but then again, it might. "I will hire a plane to follow them," it said. "Here is my card." "You won't be able to follow them immediately," the woman said, frowning. "Where did you say it was you wanted to go?" "I have to follow the Connors and Dieter von Rossbach," it said. The woman smirked. "I'm sorry, sir. There's been a mistake. That's not the name of the party that's leaving right now." She looked at him imperturbably and offered his card back to him. "Take off your sunglasses and look at her. Tell her you must follow the party that just left, whatever their names were. Tell her it's life and death. Allow her to fear it might be her life you're talking about." It took off its glasses and stared, unblinking, at the woman. "I must follow them," it said. "It is a matter of life and death." The woman found herself staring into a pair of blue eyes that didn't look human. She sucked in her breath, feeling a queasy sensation in the pit of her stomach, and the hair bristling on the back of her neck. "If I were a dog, I'd howl," she thought. In all of her life, she'd never met a gaze so terrible. Terrible in its absolute lack of fury, of anger, or impatience, or anything human. With a dry tongue, she licked her lips and felt her world narrow down to a tunnel with this terrifying man at the end of it. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice trembling. She cut him a ticket. You may want to wait in the lounge," she said, "but it will be at least an hour before your flight is cleared." "Is there any way to hasten the process?" it asked, still staring. "It could be arranged," she said. "Do it, whatever the cost," Third told her. In 10 seconds, she handed it a new ticket. "Please take a seat, sir," she said. "Someone will come for you when your plane is ready." 3 took the ticket, picked up its bag, and walked over to the small but elaborate security setup. There was the usual metal detector gate, and another, longer tunnel just beyond it. He put his bag on the belt and handed his health certificate to the guard. When the guard unfolded it and read, he walked through the metal detector. It rang. "You have metal joints?" the guard asked, looking up at the tall, apparently perfect specimen beside him. "Yes." The guard handed the paper to another uniformed man beside a console. "All right," that one said. "Everything seems to be in order. If you would please continue through." The guard indicated the abbreviated white tunnel before him. The Terminator looked at it suspiciously. There was nothing precisely like this in its files. There was no choice if it was to maintain its cover, though. It strode firmly forward. As soon as it did, Third knew it had made a mistake. The scanners were not simple X-rays. They included a highly sophisticated phased ultrasound element. The operator of the machine looked at his 3D display in astonishment. He whistled high and sharp. "Lord Jesus! That must have been one hell of a degenerative disease. Look at this guy, Arthur. It's unbelievable, man. Every one of his bones is metal. Even his jaw and teeth, for Christ's sake." "Go," Serena commanded. "Catch them, terminate them, self-destruct, rather than allow yourself to be captured by humans." From a standing start, it took the Terminator 10 seconds and 20 strides to reach 40 miles an hour. It crashed into the glass wall at the back of the waiting room with enough force to shatter the high-impact safety glass and hit the ground on its feet, legs flexed, and started running after the plane that was making its final approach. Men and women working on the ground began to yell at him. Some gave chase, but gave up after a few strides. They looked at each other in wonder, and someone called the control tower. As the plane taxied towards the velocity that would allow it to lift from the ground, Third caught up to it. It leapt onto the wing and hung on, just as the plane rose. The plane dipped, and they all brought their heads up and looked out the window. "What the hell was that?" the pilot asked. "Oh my God," Sarah murmured. It felt as though every organ in her body was trying to squeeze into the same place in her middle. "Mom," John said, his voice sounding like a warning. He felt like he'd been smacked in the center of his forehead with a tennis ball. The moment of shock before the pain hits, when you're so disorientated you're almost uncertain what's happened. Outside, a man in sunglasses was clinging to the wing of the plane. His face in profile looked remarkably like Dieter's. "What is it?" Von Rossbach asked. He undid his seatbelt and rose to cross over to their side of the aircraft. "Sit down, please," the pilot said. Sarah looked out and down. They were already over the ocean. When she looked up, she was staring into the Terminator's face. "Shit," she said, real terror in her voice. It clung to the wing until they were airborne. Then it moved, hand over hand, towards the body of the plane. Once it was close to the fuselage, 3 raked its nails down the jet's metal skin. One of the I-950's improvements had been to give the Terminator titanium steel claws, hidden beneath the human-looking fingernails. Its blow to the side of the plane broke away the fragile keratin covering that disguised this asset. The bloody bits fluttered away as steel ripped beneath 3's hands. It looked up to confront Sarah Connor's white face and considered tearing away the window plastic to get at her. 3 rejected the idea. The opening was too small. It could not reach her this way. She would escape, and it would be too vulnerable. Causing a crash at this low altitude and speed also lacked sufficient probability of mission success. It began to work its way down the fuselage, one careful blow at a time. "What the hell is going on out there?" the pilot asked, his voice sounding desperate. He was still too close to the heavily trafficked airport to put the plane on autopilot, so he couldn't go back and look. The instruments didn't show any reason for those vicious thumping sounds or that wild dip of the wing while they were taking off. "This is Owen Roberts' control," the headphones spoke. There is a man clinging to the exterior of your aircraft." "Oh, very funny," he snapped. This wasn't a frigging biplane, for God's sake. He was doing better than 300 miles per hour already. Then he thought about that dip on the wing, those weird pounding sounds. "Give me clearance for an emergency landing," he said. "I'm turning back." He called to his passengers. "No!" his passengers shouted as one. "John, stop him," Sarah said. John tightened his lips, but nodded and headed forward. Sarah and Dieter looked out the window, watching the Terminator's progress. 3 clung to the side of the doorframe and began to tear away the metal around the handle, careless of its flesh sheath. It would self-destruct soon anyway. John slipped into the co-pilot's seat. "Please return to the passenger cabin," the pilot said sharply. He didn't need this distraction, not with the tower giving him instructions and some maniac outside the plane. How was that even possible? "You can't turn the plane around," John said. The pilot looked at him. "Hey kid, there's somebody in trouble out there. We can't just ignore him." "I can fly a plane," John said quietly. He held one hand up, and there was a sudden click. The blade of the knife looked short, but extremely sharp. "If you attempt to turn back, we will kill you, and I will take over. My advice is to keep to your route and let us take care of this situation. Do you understand?" he asked. The pilot snapped a look at the kid, ready to face him down. Then something in John's eyes registered. He wasn't looking at some dumb punk kid who didn't understand the situation. He was looking at a man who meant what he said. "Sure," he said wonderingly. "You got it." "Good," John said. He smiled and squeezed the pilot's shoulder, then turned back to the passenger compartment. Somehow, the pilot felt better for that brief contact. Damned if he could figure out why. He licked his lips and toggled the comm to talk to air traffic control. "Seems we don't need to turn back after all, Owen Roberts. My passengers have the situation under control." Which, from the continued pounding, they did not. But he wasn't prepared to die on behalf of someone stupid enough to hitch a ride this way, no matter what Owen Roberts had to say. Three peeled back the metal skin and bared the locking mechanism. Reaching into the hole, he worked it, pushing hard against the pressure of air escaping the cabin with its free hand. Simultaneously, it tried to bring its foot forward, ready to step into the hatchway when it slammed open. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling and dangled ignored as Dieter flung himself at the door, catching it just as the lock disengaged. He hauled it closed by main strength, bracing one foot against the frame to give himself leverage, and looked around for something to jam the mechanism. Sarah dragged her bag close and pulled out the lid over the hidden compartment. Outside, 3 patiently worked the mechanism again. Dieter grabbed it as he saw it begin to move and tried to hold it closed. He held the handles and twisted until light swam before his eyes, his breathing coming in sharp, controlled gasps. But they turned inexorably, as though his was the strength of a child. Von Rossbach began to know real terror. This had never happened to him before. Sarah handed something to John, and he came up behind Dieter. "Let it in," John said. "Let it?" Dieter grunted. "I can't stop it." "Don't let it all the way in," Sarah said quickly. "John, this isn't a good idea," Dieter said from the corner of his mouth. "We don't have any guns." John gave his head a little shake, frowning. "Guns wouldn't work anyway. We'll use this." He held up the lump of plastique that his mother had given him. In his other hand was the detonator. "Oh joy," Dieter said weakly, closing his eyes. Taking a deep breath and a firmer grip on the hatch's handles, he allowed them to turn, then held on with all his might as the airstream sought to tear the door from his grip. 3 grasped the inside edge of the doorframe with its left hand, pushed its right arm through the opening, and began to pull up its leg. Dieter pulled the door too, catching the Terminator's forearm in the opening. 3 wasn't worried. It had tested its strength against the humans, and it had won. It angled its arm outward, and the door began to open again as it pulled its leg up. John moved forward and wrapped the plastique around the Terminator's arm just below the elbow. He didn't want to permanently damage the door. Then he inserted the detonator and gave the cap a sharp twist. "Fire in the hole!" he shouted, and they dived for their seats and huddled behind them. The door was flung open, crashing against the fuselage as the airstream took it. The charge went off with a flash and a sharp bang, filling the thin air of the cabin with the smell of burnt explosive. "What the hell are you people doing?" the pilot yelled frantically. "What the hell was that?" "Shut up!" Sarah yelled back, her hands working the soft, putty-like explosive into a long snake between her palms. When they looked up over the chairbacks, the Terminator was still holding on to the doorframe despite its shattered upper arm. Slowly, it fitted its left leg into the opening and began hoisting itself in, fighting the wind that threatened to rip it from the plane's side. Sarah handed John another rope of plastique and a detonator, and he and Dieter dived forward towards the door. John distracted the Terminator while von Rossbach slid in behind it and tried to pull the door too. With one big hand grasping the doorframe, he reached for the handle. The Terminator flailed its stub of an arm at John, then suddenly slammed its shoulder into Dieter. Von Rossbach's feet slid out from under him on the carpeted deck. He went down on his hip and looked up at the machine. It reached for him with its broken arm, looked at the ruined stub, then turned once again to John. Dieter pushed himself to his knees and once again reached for the open door, staying low to avoid another body blow. He grasped the door handle just as John got close enough to the Terminator to make Sarah gasp. Bracing his leg against the doorframe, Dieter reached out and caught the door with his other hand and heaved, pulling with all his strength against the force of the air, every muscle screaming. The Terminator gained purchase and began to pull its body forward. It was slower than it should have been, as though the small explosion had thrown it partially offline somehow. But it was still stronger than a human. With a full-throated roar, von Rossbach pulled the door to, slamming it against the body of the Terminator. It turned its head towards the Austrian and continued to thrust its body forward as hard as it could. John moved forward and wrapped the explosive just above the Terminator's knee and planted the detonator. He looked up at von Rossbach. "Go!" von Rossbach told him. Dieter could hardly let go. This monster would burst into the cabin like a shot. Von Rossbach's mind supplied an unwanted vision of the Terminator coming through the door, ripping the plastique off its leg and planting it on his chest. He pulled harder, gritting his teeth until they grated, and stopped the thing's forward motion. The charge went off after what seemed like an eternity, and Dieter was flung backward into the bulkhead, hard enough to knock him unconscious for a few seconds. When his blurred vision cleared, he was greeted by the sight of the Terminator dangling in the open doorway, trying to angle its big body close enough to the plane to swing in through the door. Dieter found he couldn't move, and all he could say was, "Ugh." "John!" Sarah said, leaping forward. She ignored the pilot's shouts as she worked the last piece of plastique between her hands. John grabbed the door and tried to drag it away from the fuselage. The hinges grated and moved reluctantly, but it was the massive push of the air that defeated him. Sarah stopped what she was doing and lent her strength to his, pulling the door towards her with all her might. 3 watched the humans try to close the door. It saw both of its primary targets within reach, if only it could get to them. Its left arm and leg dangled uselessly, and several circuits had been fried. For the moment, it had to watch them helplessly as it clung on by one hand and rapidly rerouted power. At last, it could once again move its right leg. It brought it up and hooked the doorframe with its remaining foot. Then it thrust its head through the door. Sarah and John gave a mighty heave, and the door slammed onto the Terminator's head. It worked its way forward, scraping its ears off against the unyielding steel of the door and the frame. With the crisp sound of rending metal, it thrust the stump of its left arm into the gap and pulled itself farther in by pressing its chin against the doorframe. Its shoulder inched forward. Dieter staggered erect and swiped at the blood dripping from his nose, then joined them at the door, lending his weight and strength to theirs. The Terminator was stopped for the moment. "I want the head," John said. The head? The pilot thought. He couldn't have heard that right. Sarah nodded, and leaving her son and Dieter to hold the Terminator, she began to spin a rope of plastique between her hands. "I never saw anybody work it quite that way," Dieter said dreamily. John looked at him, trying to see both his eyes, wondering if their friend was concussed. "It's how she works pastry," he said. "She does that to make these cinnamon thingies for Christmas." "Cinnamon bows," Sarah said, distractedly. She moved forward and attempted to wrap the plastique around the Terminator's neck. 3 thrust its head forward and bit, its teeth flashing. Sarah jerked back with a gasp and looked into the mutilated face with its glaring eyes. "You never get used to this," she thought, fighting back tears of frustration, her heart pounding. No one could ever get used to this." She brought her hands forward and jerked back again, while John and Dieter watched her. After a few more attempts, Dieter reached forward and pushed up on the Terminator's forehead, lifting it back with some untapped resource of muscle power that vaguely surprised him. He almost let go when the thing's blue eyes shifted to glare at him, and something within clenched and closed off his breath in sheer atavistic terror. Sarah took advantage of the Terminator's momentary distraction to flip the rope of explosive around its throat like a neckerchief. It redoubled its efforts to sink its teeth into her as she tried to push the detonator into the soft substance. With her lips tightly closed, Sarah took a deep breath, set the timer, and tried again. This time, John lifted his hand to aid Dieter, and the Terminator snapped its head up, attempting to grab him. Sarah pushed the detonator into place and then grabbed John, yanking him away. Startled by her sudden move, Dieter pulled as hard as he could against the door, using his body as a weight. Once again, he went flying as though smacked by God's pillow when the plastique blew. This time, in answer to the explosion, the Terminator's head flew into the cabin and bounced off the far wall. Bits of flesh and spatters of blood sprayed out into the cabin. Not nearly as much as from a real body, but enough. Its massive body went pinwheeling through space, exploding in a magenta ball of flame just before it hit the azure blue of the water. Dieter was slumped, once again unconscious, against the bulkhead. The door hung open. Sarah raised her head and found herself looking into the Terminator's blue eyes. It snapped its teeth at her and wobbled on the floor, helpless to make itself move towards her. "John," she said, not taking her eyes off it. "Here, Mum," he said from beside her. He was watching the Terminator too. "We'd better get that door," she said. Taking in her breath in a gasp that was too close to a sob for her liking, Sarah staggered to her feet and grabbed the door. John moved in beside her and pulled. They found that it moved better this time. At least the hinges weren't fighting them. It just wouldn't stay closed. Sarah tried to work the lock and got nowhere. Apparently something was jammed inside. "Shit," she muttered. "I can't shut the door," she shouted to the pilot. "Right there," he said, a quaver in his voice. "Okay, got her on autopilot." He came into the passenger cabin, white-faced, a sort of crowbar in his hand. There was a slot in the floor into which he inserted one end, then pushed the other end into a similar slot on the door. "That's never happened before," he said weakly. "But it's good to be prepared." He turned around to see John pick up the head. My God, he thought. The kid really did want the head. "I'll need to make a Faraday cage for this," John said to him, "to cut it off from communicating with any of its friends, assuming it has any. So I'm going to need some wires. Where can I take them from so I don't do serious damage to the plane?" The pilot watched the head dangling by its hair from John's bloody hand with fascination. Then the head swung out, face forward, and clicked its teeth at him, its eyes rolling wildly. From some place deep within, possibly the soles of his feet, the pilot felt a scream building, rushing upward until it blared out of his mouth. He leaped towards the pilot's cabin and slammed the door behind him, locking it and cowering in his seat, screaming. Sarah tusked and looked around her, then went over to Dieter, kneeling beside him to feel his pulse She looked up at John and smiled, giving him a reassuring nod. Peeling back one of Dieter's eyelids and then the other, she breathed a sigh of relief. The pupils were the same size. Pretty much. He should be all right. First, the Faraday cage, she said briskly to John, and then the pilot.